Well, welcome to this session where we are going to be exploring another couple of the domains of flourishing together. The talk that we're going to be looking at today is all about learning and resources, and it's all based on a book that I've recently written with Dr. Lynn Swanner, our keynote address for this conference. My name's Andy Wolfe. I'm the Executive Director of Education for the Church of England, and it's my pleasure to have flown over from the UK to this conference to share with you all today. In that flourishing resource, we're talking about 5 different domains of flourishing. They are purpose, the importance of knowing our why, the relationships we hold with one another, and how it's important to flourish together, not alone. In fact, it's impossible to flourish alone. We need to be together. We've been talking about our well-being, that third domain, how we see the world and how we're doing in it. And then finally, in this session, we're going to be looking at the importance of learning and the importance of resources. The Church of England wrote a document about 2 years ago, which is entitled Called, Connected and Committed. And you can download that and read that for free if you just Google Called, Connected, Committed Church of England. And inside that document, we say this: the leader needs to be gripped, energized and delighted by learning. Gripped, energized and delighted by learning. Now, often school leadership doesn't necessarily feel like that. One is often occupied with budgets and fixing broken things and internet that doesn't work and car parking and troublesome parents and planning laws and all of those kinds of things. But ultimately, our role as school leaders is all about championing the art and the craft of teaching. We seek to raise its status as a profession and wisdom in leadership across the whole curriculum. So that idea of being gripped, energized and delighted by learning, and our first calling as educational leaders being that of leading a culture of teacher excellence, which leads to flourishing together. The Flourishing Schools research that Dr. Lynn Swanner and her team undertook identified those 5 domains, and then she and I have written this book, which is coming out in the fall of 2021, entitled Flourishing Together, and it's all about these 5 domains of flourishing, 2 of which we're looking at in this session. We're talking about purpose, we're talking about relationships, well-being, teaching and learning, and resources. And we see these 5 as kind of an interacting ecology of flourishing, not one in a hierarchy, but this 5 working together and between each other to really unpack what it means to flourish in schools. We also see the ecology being the relationship between flourishing children and flourishing adults who are in flourishing schools. And quite frequently, we talk about the importance of flourishing children. Of course we do. We're leading schools. Of course we should be focusing on that kind of flourishing. But actually, unless there are flourishing adults, there probably will be no flourishing children. And too often we perhaps over-focus on children when actually the flourishing of the adults in our schools is absolutely really important to us. So let's dive into this first domain, learning. Learning, undoubtedly, learning is what students are supposed to do at school. Hardly a controversial statement. You know, if schools are not about learning, what are they about? But at the same time, learning is about that which adults do as well, that we become a community of practice. Young people want to learn from adults who are learners too, and how we interact together and therefore flourish together. In a recent paper that we wrote in the UK, we said this: developing a sustainable culture of teacher excellence is the central role of every leader in education at every level, in every context. That sustainable culture of teacher excellence. It champions the art and the craft of teaching and makes sure that the learning experience is of the very highest caliber for the students with whom we are working. In the UK, there's an organisation called the Education Endowment Foundation, and they do a range of research all about the quality of education, unpicking the key factors that lead to high quality education. In a recent report around teacher feedback, they talk about a number of key aspects to teacher learning, which is really, really important to students learning in the classroom. So we start with this idea that teaching needs to build on prior knowledge and experience, that sense of being part of a journey from the previous lesson or the previous sequence of lessons, so that we're beginning today with what we already know, that building on prior knowledge. We're breaking down complex material into smaller steps. We're seeking to build difficult concepts, but by breaking them into smaller pieces. We're talking about the retention of learning in terms of repetition and practice and retrieval, really important for every subject. We're developing carefully sequenced sessions of learning where essential concepts are well developed and knowledge and skills and principles are embedded. Teachers are using powerful analogies, illustrations, examples, explanations, comparisons and demonstrations in order to help their students flourish in every lesson. The report goes on to talk about the importance of dealing with common misconceptions. This is really important in children flourishing, where they sometimes get caught up in particular misconceptions in certain subjects. We're talking about modelling, explanation and scaffolding to support learning, making sure that students of all prior attainment and background are able to access their learning through adaptive teaching, where we're able to reshape and rethink and remodel learning. And then finally, the Education Endowment Foundation talk about the idea of self-regulation in learning, that ability for students to know where they are in their own learning, to plan, to monitor and evaluate what they're doing in terms of their progress. A really important skill for children to have, and the flourishing of children all about that ability to learn effectively and to be aware of where they are up to in their learning and what they need to do to extend it and to develop it and to enhance it. And the flourishing of students together relies on the flourishing of teachers who are championing the art and craft of teaching. And there could be no more important activity for school leaders to do than to really invest in that. The well-known author Dylan Wiliam writes extensively about the importance of teacher development, and in his book Leadership for Teaching Learning, Leadership for Teacher Learning, I beg your pardon, he says this: the main job of school leaders is to improve the work performance of those they lead. Other things that leaders do can have an impact on what's going on, but the impacts are small in comparison to developing the classroom practice of those teaching in schools. You know, when we're talking about our ethos and our vision and our values as a school, let's make sure that the pedagogy right at the heart is really exemplary, and that we're really pushing ourselves as teachers and groups of teachers to flourish together by developing our techniques and skills and abilities in those areas. In terms of professional development, therefore, for teachers, there's some really important principles that need to underpin that if we are to see flourishing adults. You might call it PD, Pro-D, we'd call it professional development. There's lots of different ways to talk about it, but the importance of teacher development is absolutely paramount in terms of the flourishing together of children and adults. That professional learning should be structured, that leads to changes in teacher practice and ultimately improvements in pupil learning outcomes. That might involve coaching or mentoring or demonstrating. It will almost certainly involve feedback on what could be better, how things could be improved, and some really clear developmental trajectory. Darling and Hammond in their 2017 paper talk about how professional development needs to be content focused, subject focused as well, incorporating active learning, developing modelling of effective practice so that people know what they need to do to move to the next level. It offers opportunities for feedback and reflection, and it's of sustained duration. This idea of teacher development being a journey that we all are on together, whatever our role in the school, over a long period of time. Teacher development is really important to the flourishing of children, of course, because every child deserves the very best learning experience that they can have. For many of us as teachers, we get to teach the same class or the same year group or the same subject many, many times, and we refine our craft over that period. But for the pupils coming through, this is their only chance in 4th grade, in 7th grade, in 10th grade. This is the moment. This is their opportunity. And therefore, a biblical understanding of valuing every child through God's eyes means that it's incumbent on us to produce the very most high quality teaching and learning experiences for our students. In terms of how we might get there, this is all about the implementation of change. And this report says this really interesting quote. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how great an educational idea or intervention is in principle. What really matters is how it manifests itself in the day-to-day work of people in schools. What actually happens on the ground, what actually comes to pass as a result of the development work that we do in terms of flourishing of pupils and teachers through effective teacher development. And there's a whole bunch of ways of thinking about this, but implementation is a process, not an event. It's something we need to plan for carefully. It's something that needs to be well monitored and needs to be well supported by our school structures. So as we think about that sense of developing a sustainable culture of teacher excellence, it's easy to think that when we talk technically about teaching, that we're now no longer talking about the flourishing of children, because flourishing is about that kind of heart or that character or that well-being, when actually the craft and the art of teaching is right at the heart of flourishing. Without great teachers, there will be no flourishing children in our schools. And we need to be confident enough to say that and confident enough to embed excellent development opportunities for all our teachers to move forward. And in fact, that's important for the flourishing of those teachers as well. It needs to be a supportive, challenging, encouraging environment, a professional environment that they can flourish in. In terms of how we might think about the kind of learning that we want to see in our classrooms, there's a really interesting insight that's offered by Professor Bill Lucas in terms of creativity in learning. We all probably think that would be a good thing to see creative students doing creative tasks and having creative learning experiences. But what does that actually mean? And Bill talks about 5 different domains of creativity. The first being inquisitive. Children, students who are inquisitive, who ask great questions, who are curious, who ask, how does that work? What could I do next? Why doesn't that work? What should I think about in the future? Sometimes those questions can be far-reaching. They can move the boundaries of learning in the classroom very significantly. And as teachers, we need to be adept and adaptable to the kind of questions that pupils want to ask. But we want to create environments where children can be inquisitive, because that's the first step in their creativity. Secondly, he talks about being persistent in creativity, trying new things out, making mistakes, being comfortable with things going wrong, and learning from them. Thirdly, the idea of being collaborative in learning. That I learn from you, you learn from me, and my creativity might spark something off in you that could lead to greater flourishing. Fourthly, the idea of being disciplined in our creativity. We need structures and regimes and different ways of articulating the way that learning happens, so that through those structures, creativity can be released through our sense of imagination. And imagination, right at the heart of flourishing. Children need to imagine a future that does not yet exist. Something that they can walk towards, run towards, that they can walk towards and run towards together in their classes, so that they've got that sense of imagination. So that idea of creativity being inquisitive, persistent, collaborative, disciplined and imaginative. Really important for that idea of flourishing in learning. British professor Michael Young at the Institute of Education has written this really interesting book called Knowledge and the Future School. And he is challenging in this book where he talks about what are schools actually for. It's a great question. We talked about purpose in a previous session, about what our core purpose is in terms of what are we educating for. And Michael Young in this talks about something called powerful knowledge, the idea that when we teach effectively, we empower young people to think differently, to act differently, to open up new pathways and opportunities. And as we empower young people in the communities that we serve, we enact social justice through our educational approaches. And this is really important in terms of the kind of flourishing that we want to see. We want to see children released from structures that hold them back. We want to see children experiencing things they've never experienced before, having horizons open to them that lead them on to further learning, and there must be more. He goes on to talk about the importance of a subject-led curriculum. He sees knowledge as an entitlement to children, an entitlement of children that enlightens, stretches, and challenges, and in fact, knowledge that liberates through empowering young people. You know, that's the kind of school I want to work in. That's the kind of school I want my children to go to, where knowledge is seen in that way, in a way that can be a genuine encounter with something that goes on to change the world as a result of the discovery, the creativity, and the discipline that that involves. Teaching and learning is not simply about transferring knowledge from one head to the other. The goal is not simply, I've got all the knowledge, how can I give it to you and all your peers in the classroom? Teaching and learning effectively is about the importance of character education as well as achievement. And there's a really important relationship between those two things in the flourishing of children and adults, in fact. Our character makes a huge difference to the sense of achievement that we have. It makes a huge difference to our sense of persistence and of trying new things and of taking risks in learning. In some of the writing about this, we talk about the idea of performance under pressure. And there's on the slide behind me, you can see this acronym TCUP, TCUP. It stands for Thinking Correctly Under Pressure. Thinking correctly under pressure. When we're under pressure, we don't necessarily always think straight, do we? We panic, we make decisions quickly. We actually are far better off stopping and pausing and talking to our colleagues rather than just rushing in. But this principle of thinking correctly under pressure is really integral to the flourishing of children when they find themselves in pressurized situations. How have we developed their character so that they take their time to make good decisions rather than rush in? When we take risks in our learning, we ultimately end up making mistakes, but we also ultimately end up progressing and enhancing and achieving more effectively because of the courage that we've been given. And as teachers, we need to be courage givers. We need to create classrooms that are full of courage and risk-taking and adventure in learning, so that that full flourishing, that life in all its fullness that we long to see for the children that we serve, is really underpinned by a courageous activity that takes children towards excellence in their achievement and that idea of self-affirmation through that risk-taking. Leaders who love their pupils recognize the transfer of fear that can ensue from the macro to the school, from the school to the teacher, from the teacher to the pupil, and take great care of them, particularly at pressure points of testing. I'm sure it's true in the Canadian system or the US system or the UK system that there's pressure at all points in the system, which doesn't always lead to our flourishing. There's pressure from government, there's pressure from stakeholders, there's pressure from governance, of standards, of accountability, of high performance testing, and things that should always be getting better and better. And that pressure moves from that kind of macro level down to the school level. And from the school level, it can easily be transferred to the teacher, A teacher then becomes quite fearful of what they're doing in the classroom because they're worried about what might go wrong. And ultimately, the teacher transfers that fear onto the pupil, who then becomes at risk of failure as a result. And actually, our role as educators is not to transfer fear. It's not to set up systems that create fear in our young people, that make them scared of the consequences, but rather our role is to transfer hope, to build character. Imagine if you were asked, what do you do for a living? And you said, my role is to transfer hope into the children that I teach. To transfer hope. Not simply to transfer knowledge or to transfer structural appreciation, but to transfer hope. My role is to give hope to other teachers, to create a hopeful community in which children are much more likely to flourish. That would be excellence in teaching. In order for children to flourish in their learning, they need to be securely attached in great relationships. And this model from Schofield and Beck's really helps us understand it. We've got this idea of being available, being sensitive, having acceptance, cooperation, being part of a family. These are not kind of woolly, fluffy things that we need to push to one side when we're talking about excellence in teaching, but rather they are integral to the success of our young people, creating those safe spaces, those secure relationships in which people can learn, in which children can flourish together. And ultimately, we're therefore about the formation of children for the transformation of the world. The formation of children for the transformation of the world. And that sounds a really grand thing to say, but that sense of deeper flourishing of children is down to high quality teaching and learning being at the heart of a school's vision for flourishing together. So that's that first domain, learning, the centrality of that and the culture of teacher excellence. The second part of this session and the fifth domain of flourishing is the idea of thinking about our resources, our physical resources, our financial resources, our human resources. Because schools are real places occupied by real people, where we meet together matters. Our campuses are shaped by our access to physical, technological, and human resources, which in turn shapes our experience at schools. However, simply having enough is not really enough. Instead, we're talking here about great stewardship and generosity in our resources. And those can therefore contribute effectively to flourishing in comparison to a competition or scarcity mindset that we might otherwise have. And as this quote says, frequently our use of resources is a much clearer indicator of our vision than maybe what's written on our walls or on our mission statements. How we spend our money, invest our time, is actually a really good reflection of what we actually believe in and our decision making as a result. In the Bible, there is one resource that is mentioned more than any other right through the Old Testament and New Testament. It's not the resource of money. It's actually the resource of bread. That is the most commonly mentioned resource throughout the whole biblical text. And I'm just going to share a few insights from the biblical text around the nature of bread. It might seem a strange way to think about in terms of resources, but it's one of the most common metaphors that's used through the scriptures to think about this. Our daily bread, it's normal, it's necessary, we need it, it gives us life. It's empowering, it's humbling, it's enabling. But most importantly, it's to be broken and eaten together. Countless times, relationships are formed and communities are solidified through the biblical text when people sit down to eat together. I'm going to talk about 3 simple examples of this that come up in the book that we've written, Flourishing Together, which you can get hold of. The first one is a famous story where 5,000 people are fed. In fact, we think it's probably more than 5,000 people because it's 5,000 adults that are mentioned, plus a bunch of kids. And in this story, there's all kinds of interesting things that happen. It's a little bit like we've got the kind of highlight reel just for this story when we read the text. There's loads of details we'd love to see filled in that perhaps aren't there. But there's a real challenge in the story between a scarcity and abundance mentality. When it becomes clear that all these people are hungry, that they need something real, that they're not going to survive unless they have that, the disciples panic. They come to Jesus saying, goodness, these people need something to eat. Where are we going to get that from? They've got a scarcity mindset, a mentality that says we don't have enough. What are we going to do? And Jesus says, simply, have the people sit down. I mean, what a crazy thing to say. Have the people sit down. Why would you say that? And what happens is that Jesus teaches us that we are much more, it's much more important to focus on our possibilities in resources rather than our limitation. To focus on our possibilities than our limitations. And what happens is that the flourishing of this whole community, of the 5,000 men and women and children, many more beyond, is released in and through the community, not alone. Jesus doesn't say, have them sit down and they can fend for themselves, every man for himself. He says, have them sit down. And what happens then is the boy comes with his lunch, a simple lunch. And in the Greek, it's the most simple kind of bread that you can have. It was a barley bread. It was the most basic thing that he could have possibly brought. Few loaves, couple fish. And from there, the miracle is released. And isn't it fantastic that in that story of bread for all, the flourishing of that whole crowd, isn't it incredible that it's released ultimately not by an adult who thinks they've got all the answers, but a child who brings something to sacrifice. That idea of 5,000 fed shows us that flourishing is released in community, not alone. The second example is the Last Supper. The night before Jesus is betrayed and the crucifixion and everything, he sits down with his disciples. It's a normal thing that they do. The use of resources in school, it's normal. We need computers, we need chairs, we need tables, we need windows, we need electricity. We need lunch, we need water. It's normal stuff that releases the flourishing of children, without which it's very difficult to do so. But in this normal activity, the flourishing is released in community. And by establishing these kind of rhythms and practices, Jesus is saying, this is how I want you to remember me. In this story, it's clear that this is a story about sacrifice. He breaks the bread, blesses the cup, says, do this in remembrance of me, of a sacrifice I'm about to make. It's a remembrance of a giving of oneself for another, the idea of a sacrifice. And that's really important in our kind of resource thinking, whether we have a scarcity or an abundance mindset, how we go about thinking about sacrifice. And in the normal day-to-day eating of bread, we see the divine. Every time we sit down together to eat, we should remember Jesus. Every time we have a normal mealtime, every time we snap a piece of bread together, it shows us that that resource reminds us of Christ incarnate, of Jesus and his love for us. Finally, a third story of bread. Well, it's hardly a story, it's a prayer. How should we pray? How should we talk to God? In the middle of that prayer, he says, give us today our daily bread. Give us today our daily bread. There's a material recognition that resources are important. It doesn't say, give us today everything we would love. Give us today an extravagant steak dinner. Give us today champagne and oysters and caviar. It just says, give us today our daily bread. Give me today that which I need. As a child in a classroom, that might be a pen, it might be a book, it might be a desk, it might be a pencil, it might be a computer. But the resources that we need in our schools release the flourishing. The prayer is simple, it's regular, it's expectant. It's an orientation to God that says, please, Lord, give us today our daily bread. It's fascinating that in something that we think is super spiritual, the ultimate model of prayer that Jesus gives us, there's a very material thing that's talked about in the middle of the prayer. Why does bread show up in this prayer? It doesn't seem a really holy thing. It doesn't seem a really extravagant spiritual thing. But bread is right at the heart because we recognize that our flourishing is in some way dependent on the resources that we need and the abundance mentality that we can grow. Finally, this prayer shows us this is about us, not me. The flourishing together is about we, not I. It's almost like a kind of grammar of flourishing together. The plurality, that we flourish together, not alone. It would be a different prayer if it said, give me today all I need for me to survive. But rather it says, together, give us today our daily bread, all that we need to flourish. And that should be our prayer in our schools. And the ability to see things with an abundance mentality makes us generous in our resources. It makes us think of other schools, of other contacts, of other colleagues who maybe need things that we have. It helps us to give away rather than just think me, me, me. Abundance mentality says, what can I give? Not just what can I gain? One of my colleagues in the UK runs a school, and she says this: because we say there are no limits for our pupils, there are no ceilings, this leads to no excuses. It all comes back to the releasing of the richness of the community itself. The school is not the saviour, it's the catalyst for the community to change itself. And she calls this an upward spiral of abundance. When I start giving to you, you start feeling you might have something to give too. She says where each person's use of resources inspires the next. We recognize what we have. We have an ability, a potential to give, not just to seek to gain. And therefore we can see our flourishing is released more and more as we work together in terms of our resources. Finally, as we come into land in this session, we ask what we can give. In doing so, we reflect something of the divine. As we reflect on the very nature of God, who seems most interested in giving away that which is most precious, that generosity, that benevolence, that compassion. We're drawn to the words of the poet Christina Rossetti. It's a famous poem turned into a Christmas carol, which you may sing at the holiday season, perhaps. But she says this: what can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would bring a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. Yet what can I give him? I give him my heart. And often we think of this very famous poem all around, it's all about the heart, it's about me offering myself and giving something of who I am in my very own being. But actually what's beautiful in this poem is it says that giving is about actual resources. If you're a shepherd, that's what you've got to give. You've got a lamb. You don't have anything else to give. That's your resource. And it's the same in our schools. Our resources are super important to the way that we flourish together and how that greater flourishing and abundance is released for all. So in this session, we tried to cover two of those domains that we focus on in the book Flourishing Together. Firstly, learning and the importance of quality first teaching. And secondly, the importance of resources and the giving away of those. Those two combined with three others: relationships, well-being, and purpose, to make the 5 domains of flourishing together. And as we create that ecology of flourishing, so the flourishing of children and adults is released in flourishing schools. Thank you very much.